Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Kay. It has been a pleasure for me to spend the last 4 months in Edinburgh as a Fulbright scholar and to do some research with the fine colleagues there, and I hope to share some of that with you today. And I was actually counting up, it has almost been 20 years since I've been teaching community or population health, so it's been a very long time. But I'm delighted to be here. How many of you, this is your first NET conference like me? Oh, good. Oh, wow, that's about half the crowd. Fabulous. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted to know about the interprofessional nature that this conference has taken on, because I don't think that as a nurse I can say I can't do everything by myself. We need to work together. We need to be partners together in this business of health. So I want to give just a few acknowledgments to my fabulous research partners, whom some of you may know, Drs. Ian Atherton and Richard Kyle at Edinburgh Napier, and to the student intern we had for part of our research this summer from the Netherlands, Mariska Scheffer, and also to the US-UK Fulbright Commission and Beta Psi chapter of Sigma Theta Tau International, my home chapter, for funding this research that we've been doing this summer. I would just say, interestingly, the US-UK Fulbright Commission has actually received more Brits to the US than it has sent US folks to Britain. So if you're interested at all, talk to me, okay? Because it's a great opportunity to do some international exchange. That was just a little parenthetical comment. So first of all, I want to bring you greetings from where I live, which is Oregon in the USA, which is the state that is north of California. Everybody knows where California is for some reason, but not everybody knows where Oregon and Washington are. That's considered the Pacific Northwest. And for those of you who are here from New Zealand, and I've met a couple of you, I would say that New Zealand is like Oregon on steroids. That's my assessment. I got to spend 3 months in New Zealand in 2004, and it was such a delight, but it's very similar. And there's many things about Oregon and Washington that are similar to Scotland as well, I've found. This is actually a photo from my university. My university, medical, nursing, dental, and pharmacy colleges is on a hill. We've outgrown the hill, so we have a tram now. It was free land granted to the state by a fellow who bought the land sight unseen, thinking he was going to build a railway station at the top of this hill. Not happening. Anyway, you can see we have a beautiful mountain in the background. This is Portland, Oregon. We have 5 campuses all around the state, and so I'm at the largest of the 5. So just a little bit more about me. Kay introduced with a few bits and bobs. She mentioned my new favorite Scottish phrase. I don't know if it's just Scottish. Is it British too? Yeah, okay. So I would tell you that my destiny as a teacher was struck in childhood when my mother informed me I should be a teacher because I was so bossy. I have been a nurse for over 40 years, actually closer to 50 than 40. I've always been a questioner. I want to know why we do things the way we do and what we do and why we do them. I began my career as an educational researcher in the early 2000s. I was one of those late bloomers as far as getting my doctorate when I was in my 50s. And we can also talk about that when we network, when we have time together. Most of my clinical experience has been in population health, in home health, in community health, in population health. I began my work as an international collaborator at a meeting very much like this. So when Phil mentioned the idea of networking, I would just say that's how I met the folks at Napier that I have been doing research with 4 years ago at a conference similar to this. And we found we had so much in common that we wanted to do more work together. So I would really encourage that networking. And then the last characteristic that I have, I'm going to call, is a pragmatic provocateur. And a provocateur is somebody who provokes thinking, and I aspire to become better at this as I go on in years. Inspires people to think, but also I'm one of those people who likes to be able to use what I think about. Thinking alone isn't that much of interest to me. I want to think in order to do. So I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts, but I also am going to be sharing with you some ideas that you can go home with and use or think about and modify for whatever reason. So that's just a little bit more about me. The 2 ladies who are in the picture with me, by the way, were 2 of my nursing faculty when I was a student. Kay mentioned that I teach at the same university. I've taught at other universities, but I've come back home, if you will, to the university where I became a nurse, and these are two of my nursing faculty. You can tell that they weren't that much older than I when I was in school. So they go on and they continue to be mentors for me, which is lovely. So just a little bit about the Fulbright research that I've been doing this summer. Two studies, a quantitative study looking at Edinburgh Napier students and Oregon Health and Science students from around the state, their attitudes toward poverty and social justice, because these are two things we talk about in population health. And we used two, just to give you a brief overview of that. We're in the process of writing up the results right now, but the long story short is that the students, we did a pre and a post-term scale of both attitudes toward poverty and attitudes toward social justice, as well as a demographic survey to find out who these were. And despite the fact that the students were very different, in Scotland the students were quite young by comparison to OHSU students who tend to be second career students, we found that there were differences in terms of the fact that the OHSU students tended to have more positive attitudes toward people who were living in poverty and to have more positive social justice attitudes. But the only thing that stood out demographically about that was that in our school we have clinical placements that are population-based at the same time they're getting the population theory. At Edinburgh Napier, that isn't the case. People drift in and out of placements, and so that was the only thing we could find. We're trying to make sense of what that means from an educational point of view, the implication of that. I mean, it seems fairly straightforward, but maybe not. But today I'm going to focus a little bit more on the second study. I had the privilege, and I say that with all honesty and humility, the privilege of talking with 24 nursing leaders, interviewing them in Scotland and at the highest levels in the UK from 3 different sectors, academic, regulatory, and practice. And I would just say that, again, this is a very nursey thing, but the Nursing and Midwifery Council, NMC, sorry, Phil. I'm with you on acronyms. I think my brain has run out of room for acronyms is the problem. The NMC has actually come out with new standards that include something that has heretofore not been as well fleshed out, and that's this whole idea of illness prevention and health promotion. And so that actually is the reason that I have been in Scotland, having coordinated with these 2 researchers, Richard Kyle and Ian Atherton, starting 4 years ago. We knew these standards were coming out, and we all, the 3 of us, feel quite passionate about this need for all of us, and I'm including all of you, even if you're not a nurse, for all of us to think more about population health and to help our students think more about population health. So I don't need to tell most of you, and probably not any of you, what is happening in the world today of healthcare. We are starting to see static or declining health outcomes, including in the States. We are not, our life expectancies are sort of maintaining, but they're not growing longer at the same rate as other developed countries. Many of us, not all of us I'm sure, are growing a little bit older. And in the US, for example, 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 every day. Isn't that shocking? I couldn't find a similar figure for the UK or for Australia, but I looked. Anyway, I think it's a pretty amazing figure. We know that obesity, smoking, alcohol, diabetes, inactivity, these are all major challenges in our very civilized cultures, right? We eat well, we drink a lot, we smoke too much. Some of that has led to diabetes, and some of us are just plain couch potatoes. We see that hospital stays are shorter, the acuity of patients is much higher, and that results in some staffing changes. And speaking of staffing changes, I read yesterday in one of the UK papers that 1 in 4 nursing students drops out before they finish their program. And 1 in 10 nurses drop out of the National Health, National Health Service, the primary healthcare giver in the UK, every year. So we're losing more than we're gaining, it feels like. And we have some of the same challenges in the US as well. And then there is this business about cost of healthcare. Wherever you're from, I suspect the cost of healthcare is too high. Certainly in the US, we have the highest cost of healthcare of anywhere in the world. And when I say cost of healthcare, I mean per person. This was a headline that came out this summer while I was in Scotland, and admittedly this is a little bit jaded because the doctors are saying that the NHS is stretched to the limit, and it had to do with a pay raise for nurses, which didn't really fully materialize. But I would just say that not one single person of the 24 that I spoke to had anything but the bad news to say about the NHS, the National Health Services system, is overstretched. Too many people are in the hospital, too many people coming to emergency services, and it cannot go on. And that, I guess, is what I would say to you. It is reaching a burgeoning over-the-top limit. Now, the other thing I think is really problematic in all of our cultures, as far as I know, I don't know who all are here from 18 countries, but I've spoken to some of you from the UK, from Australia, and from New Zealand. But I think, in general, we tend to educate our nurses, and I suspect other disciplines as well, in silos. Okay, so we have nursing over here, we have medicine here, we have pharmacy here, we have nutrition here. And that's just the way we've kind of done it for years. But I would say even within nursing, we have done a lot of siloing of topics so that the students, the endpoint for the students is they don't always see the connection between a population health course, an acute care course, a chronic course, maternal child course, that sort of thing. We tend to educate in modules and courses so that the students don't necessarily see the interconnections. Do you agree with me? Okay, so I guess I would like us to think about how can we connect these silos a bit. Well, here's the long and the short of it from my perspective. As much as we need good nurses in hospitals, and other healthcare providers as well, I believe we spend too much time talking about illness care. We don't really have health care. We have illness care in most of our countries. And one of the persons I spoke to this summer told me that at least, and this was an NHS person, at least 80% of the resources in Scotland go toward hospitals and toward hospital care. And yet, people don't spend most of their lives in the hospital, do they? They spend most of their lives doing the things that we all enjoy doing. They work, they have families, they go on vacation. Those are the kinds of things that people do, and they really don't spend a lot of time thinking about being sick, and in many cases don't think a lot about how to prevent illness as well. But I'm positing here that we need more balance in terms of health care. We're focusing too much on illness care. We spend, in nursing at least, I can say we spend a lot of time on skills checklists, and most of those skills will only be used in hospitals. We need to think more about skills that can be used generally, and I'm going to talk more about that as we go along. So in my mind, it's time to initiate a healthcare culture change. We need to focus, as I've said, more on illness prevention and health promotion, just as the Nursing and Midwifery Council have advised. And I would say that this time when they put together their standards, they talked to lots of people from all over the place, not just regulatory folks, but people in practice, people in education, and got a lot of consultation around what the standards needed to say. But it's time for all of us, regardless of our discipline or our profession, to really step up to prepare the next generation for the reality that healthcare systems as we know them today are not sustainable. I really believe that with all my heart. So as a starting place, let's talk about what we mean by population health, because this may be a new term for you. It's actually kind of a new term in the sense that it's really only been around for, since the beginning of the 2000s, the new century. And in that time, it's actually morphed since that time. At that time, it was all about monitoring outcomes of groups of individuals. That was all population health was defined as. It has now become a much broader definition, and this definition, as you can see by the ... at the end of the quote there, goes on. But population health is now broadly used to describe collaborative activities for the improvement of a population's health status. So I love that collaborative part because I think that's really important, but I would also add regardless of where people practice. Because it's my belief that, and I'm going to share with you some of my beliefs, I'm going to try to let you know what are my beliefs and what come from evidence and what come from the people I've spoken to this summer. But it's my belief that we, now I lost my train of thought. It'll come back to me. But anyway, why do you think health professionals need to learn about population health? Well, it's for all the reasons that we've already talked about in terms of this is an area that we need to spend more time on and focus on. So I'm going to offer you 6 possibilities today for you to think about and to think about taking back to your colleagues and chatting about. If you're a person who's taking notes, I would encourage you to write down your questions because at the end I'm going to ask you a question and then you'll also have the opportunity to ask me a question. So, but these are 6 of the topics that we're going to talk about in terms of how we can all increase our ability to talk about population health. And even as I said that, the thing I forgot just a slide or 2 ago was that all of us practice population health. We may not call it that, and most of us don't consider ourselves experts in population health. But when we set up infection control policies in a hospital, what's that about? It's to protect the people who are in the hospital, isn't it? When we make an issue of vaccinating children so that they don't get disease, regardless of what setting we're in, that's a population health issue. So we practice population health no matter what setting we're in, and I think that's really an important feature of what we need to get across to our students. It's our responsibility, and I'm not just talking to nurses here, it's our responsibility to think broadly about how we give health messages to people we know, how we interact with the community in which we live, or in which we go to church, or in which we go to school, or our children go to school, and we are seen as experts in health. And let's practice being experts in health, not just in illness. So, talking about population health. As I mentioned, all health professionals practice population health, but sometimes we need to point it out to students. We need to be intentional about making the connection for them. There's so much of what we do, and we were having this discussion at the dinner table last night, there's so much of what we do that we do because we do it. It's intuitive, it's not something we necessarily think about, and yet our students, and I don't care what we're talking about here, whether it's acute care, hospital care, population, community care, we need to make the point out loud to our students so they can connect the dots. We need to help them learn how to connect those dots and to become more aware of how things fit together. And that involves talking out loud. As Kay mentioned, most of my research has been done in clinical judgment, and how nurses make judgments is a really interesting thing, but most of us become very intuitive over time, particularly if we've remained in a particular area of practice, a specific area of practice, and we don't think about how we make those decisions, but our students need for us to say out loud how we do it. I think we need to use the language of population health. We talk about population statistics, such ideas of incidence of disease, prevalence of disease. We're going to talk a fair amount today about the social determinants of health, which may sound like something you've heard of, but maybe you're not sure what that is. And then this whole idea of population health is where we consider the community the client, or the population the client, rather than just one individual. Now, communities are all made up of individuals, right? And we still need to take care of individuals, but I am suggesting we need to think more broadly about where that individual lives and how we take care of that individual impacts a larger group. Actually, that brings up a really wonderful story for me. I spent some time working with a team in Mexico doing some cleft lip and palate repair surgery. And our oldest patient was actually 34 years old, a gentleman, and when it was time for him to go home, he spent the night in the hospital, and then the next day, this pickup truck rambled down the dirt road toward where we were set up as a quote-unquote hospital, and I loosely use that term. But the truck was full of people from the village where this man was from, and the mayor wanted to give a speech, and so he did, and it was interpreted for us. And he said, this is a man we've taken care of for his entire life because he can't have a job, he can't find a wife, he doesn't have a family in town. All of these things that they had been caring for this individual, now, he said, he can get a job, he can find a wife, he can have a family. And it was just such a wonderful moment to think about how this changed not just the life of this individual, but the life of the entire community in which he lived. So when I have the word example up here, here's some ideas that you might take home. This is the pragmatic part. Here are some ideas that you might take back to your School of Nursing in terms of how we integrate population health. Here is a list of actual causes of death in the US from a few years back, but I am assuming that most of it is pretty similar, and I am assuming that most of it's similar to most of the countries where you're from. And you can see that these are things that are not cancer, heart disease, and other kinds of things, but contribute toward those causes of death. These are all causes of death that can be altered, that can be changed, that can be modified, that can be improved. And all of us can have a role in that improvement, can't we? These are things that we have the opportunity to help patients understand and realize might be detrimental to their health. Some of them may not know that. So that's one thought. How do you engage students in a discussion about how can we help modify some of these actual causes of death? Here's a good one. The whole idea of equality versus equity. And you can see, if you think about healthcare, you can see that equality, and in a system like the National Health Service, I'm assuming that equality is one of the goals. That everybody has the same plate handed to them in terms of what they get from the National Health Service by way of care. But I would ask the question, is that equitable? And is that something that we need to think a little differently about, that maybe there are some folks who need a little bit more help in order to have the same opportunity as those of us who may be in a different place? I love that little diagram. I just think it's so visually meaningful. It's very readily available online, by the way. Just enter equity versus equality diagram and it'll pop right up for you. So the other thing I think we need to do is to seek out information about population health. And there are a number of organizations who have models and initiatives, and I've just listed a couple here. The World Health Organization Health 2020 goals, from the UK, from WHO, from the World Health Organization. In the US, the Centers for Disease Control has developed Healthy People 2020 goals for populations, and they're currently working on the Healthy People 2030 goals. In other words, it happens every 10 years that we set goals, and they're real goals. They're like 65%, we'd like 65% of those over 65 to have flu vaccinations in a given year. And what on that particular note, by the way, because I used to run a flu prevention program, you'll find that in fact we do meet that, the 65%. As a country, we do meet that goal. But if you start to break it down by ethnic groups, you'll find that white people exceed that goal tremendously, and darker-skinned people don't even come close to that goal. So there's a way to look at statistics that is really helpful. Then I love to bring newspapers to class and to talk about what are the population issues that are in the newspaper today. And the papers are full of them. And here are just some examples. Drink driving policy changes, suicide rates of older adult men, gun control legislation, which is probably more an issue in the US than any of your countries, school lunch policies, rising pharmaceutical costs, immigration status. These are all topics that you're going to find on the front page of newspapers that impact health. And I'm encouraging you to think about remember the old current events when you were in grade school and you had to bring a current event to talk about? This is similar in that way. What's a current event in healthcare that you can bring to the classroom to help your students learn to think in a broader way about population health? And then there are the social determinants of health. And this is an old model, but it's a very workable one from my perspective. Look at the green band in particular. These are all determinants of health. Food production, and I would say not just food production, what goes into producing food, but also where does it come from, what pesticides were used, is it genetically modified, how accessible is food is another thing. Education, some people with lower levels of education may need that extra crate to stand on to be at an equal place in terms of healthcare. Work environment, we have a lot of issues around environment in general, air, water. The work environment involves toxic items sometimes. Unemployment, how does that impact health? Water and sanitation. Healthcare services in our country, the students are quite sure that if everybody had equal access to healthcare, which they do not, that our problems would be solved. And all I need to do is to bring to them some of the statistics from the UK that show that many of our issues are the same, regardless of the fact that in the UK there is this equal access. Housing is a huge issue and is becoming very well known. And speaking of housing, let's look, this is an example, again, of something you might bring to your students and say, what are the ways in which housing does impact health? We can think about neighborhood safety and whether or not people can get out for a walk to do some exercise. What's available in the community, and I would add grocery stores to this, because in our city, in the poorest areas, grocery stores, fresh fruits and vegetables are not necessarily readily available, or people have to take the bus to get somewhere where they are readily available. Types of housing, is it high density housing? Is the housing structure adequate? Does the roof leak? I've been in homes as a home health nurse where there wasn't running water in the US. And you just have to look at all these things and how it impacts health. How do you do a dressing change if you don't have running water? How do you wash your hands just for sanitation if you don't have running water? Or maybe it's only the bathtub where you can find the running water, not in the sinks. What does an address mean to people? And in our country, it means that you might get to sign up for some services if you have an address. But if you're homeless and you don't have an address, maybe you can't sign up for those services. Social isolation is a growing problem among our older adults, and this has to do with a lot of the mobility of people in this day and age. Many seniors are isolated from their families and living in the home they've always lived in, and it may not be adequate for their needs. It may be that they're unable to get out of their homes because of steps, because of stairs. So all of these things, students might say, well, what difference does it make what kind of a house somebody lives in? We need to help them make that connection to health. And this is just an example of how you might consider doing that. So one of my interviewees talked about just moving. And I want to just read to you what this person had to say and then say, this could be a housing case study. So this person said, I recently moved from an area which from a population point of view is one of the 20% most deprived areas of Scotland. The move was about a mile away to one of the top 5% areas in Scotland. Nothing changed in terms of my lifestyle. Nothing happened in terms of anything else, but from a population point of view, I'm now going to live another 10 years. Well, we know that's sort of the reality and the absurdity all in one package, right? But the questions for students that I might encourage you to ask if you presented a case study similar to that is, what might be the social determinants of health that exist a mile apart and could change life expectancy so dramatically for the people living there? And to encourage them to actually look at the data that's so readily available. And in UK, I know that there's tons of data. It's much more readily available, in part, I think, because you have a unified healthcare system than it is in our country. But what do the census data, for example, tell you about the differences between these two areas? One of the questions I asked my interviewees this summer was, what should every new graduate, and I would extend that to say health professional, know about population health, regardless of where they think they're going to practice? And these were the top seven answers. And in order, recognize the individual within a larger context. This idea of recognizing that that patient lying in the bed is not just a patient like everyone else in the hospital, even though they might look the same. They all have the same gown on, they all are in a room that's very similar, and we tend to treat them the same sometimes when they're in the hospital. But we need to recognize that that individual comes from a much larger context. Now, most of our students, especially if they're younger, know the context in which they came from, but they may not know about different kinds of contexts that others might have grown up in or come from or live in. The second item that they said was to understand a little bit about the psychology of change and of behavior and how difficult change is for people. And to have that understanding of Prochaska's readiness for change is an example of that. If you're not familiar with that, it's a great little theory that you can work on a bit. But in any event, the idea of recognizing that change of behavior is not that easy. And sometimes these first two things can be accomplished by initiating a self-awareness kind of activity and or helping them to identify something about their own behavior that they'd like to change and what steps they would go through to make that happen. We've talked a little bit about the social determinants of health that impact health. Then the fourth item was this idea about policy and politics. And most of the folks that I spoke to, or not most, a lot of them talked about this need for students to have a much bigger idea of how policy gets made, to be more politically active, to at least vote, if not become engaged with their MP or their legislator to put out the changes that might need to be made. The idea of connecting population and epidemiology, and when I speak of epidemiology, I'm not just talking about diseases, infectious diseases or contagious diseases, I'm talking about social issues too, addiction, adverse childhood events, those kinds of things that we see in our culture. In our country, we have an opioid crisis, which I understand is not the case here in the UK anyway, and I don't know about some of the other countries, but it's an amazing thing of how that's come about and what the impact on our population is because of it. Next to last, or sixth, the skills for encouraging change. How do we talk to people in ways that help them know what their options are, that help them think differently about their behavior and their lifestyle choices? This is what these interviewees thought needed to be taught to our students. We teach our students about motivational interviewing. I know that's something of a controversial topic because some people think it's such a specialty, but at least it gets them practicing some of the change talk that can help patients, clients, think differently about their choices. And the last one, how to access or interpret data or evidence. And I mentioned the idea of accessing the census data. For most of us, we've never done that. I know when I first started teaching population health, I'd never looked at the census data. There is a wealth of information there that can impact health that your students and you probably need to be aware of. So I would encourage you to think about these things. This is very unofficial. We're knee deep in data at this point. Transcripts, double pages about this high. So this is just something that I'm offering by way of preliminary findings from the research that we conducted this summer. But I thought it was interesting enough to share with you. Fourth, collaborate with community partners. And by and large, the interviewees told me that it will help students get that larger context of where people live, where they work, the problems that they're dealing with. Not just the one problem that they see lying in the bed, but that bigger context in terms of what people have to deal with. I always tell my students, I don't care if you ever become a community health nurse or a population health nurse. What I do care about is that you have a sense that your patients that you're taking care of in the hospital come from somewhere and go home to somewhere. And sometimes that somewhere is helpful in terms of optimizing health, and sometimes it's a barrier to optimizing health. So I want my students to understand that. Collaborating with community partners can help our students to understand the referral process and what the services are that are out there. And I think this is something that becomes, when we're focused on the patient in the bed, we don't always think about, this person wants to quit smoking. Where do I send them? What do I tell them? We need to help them understand a little bit about how to make referrals to community resources. And then I'd like to suggest, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples, that having students in community placements can be a reciprocal benefit for both parties, both the community partner as well as the students. So this is a program that we have at our school in all 5 locations where students work in interprofessional teams in neighborhoods or communities where marginalized people live. So for example, we have students working in a neighborhood where there are many homeless people or people who live in marginal housing situations. Our students basically case manage those clients that are referred to them and then call in our medical, dental, or pharmacy colleague students, peers into a home visit to chat with the clients in those settings. It's been an incredible experience. We've been able to quantify the idea of how much money has been saved. And speaking of, we have another program in another part of town where people were calling 911 or 999, whatever the emergency services, altogether too frequently for non-emergencies. And so our nursing students have been working with those clients as well as the fire department in that area. And the fire department has seen it as so valuable in terms of reducing the number of calls that they've gotten, the non-emergent calls, that they've actually hired one of our faculty in a position half-time, and then our university covers the other half to keep up that program and to help manage that, to sustain that program because it's been so beneficial. Some of my interviewees mentioned the idea of assigning a student to a family throughout their entire educational experience, just to see what kinds of things come up in from a health lens in that family during the 3-year period that the students are in the school. One of my colleagues in the States, Jean Giddens, some of you may know that name, actually developed a virtual neighborhood. And that accomplished the same thing, essentially, in that there were multiple families who lived in this neighborhood, and during the time that students were in their program, the neighborhood changed and morphed, and people died, and people were born, and people became ill. Fascinating. 5th, zoom out to care for communities. You can see that maybe you can't see, but this little duo of a little boy and a little girl are actually right there. So by zooming out, what do you learn? Well, you learn that, first of all, these are toys, not real people, but also you learn that there's a whole community surrounding that house where the children live, and that might change how you approach a family in that situation. I've had my students write a persuasive letter to a legislator or about a situation that they've become familiar with and aware of during the time that they're in the course, and they have to annotate it with references and cite them. We've taken our students to the state capitol to actually speak with their own legislator. I don't know how that would work here in the UK. I do know I've been to the Scottish Parliament a couple of times, and they seem very welcoming in terms of people coming to talk with them about issues. And I think most likely there is a way to do this. We actually encourage the students to come, and we give them issues to talk about, and we give them some talking points. And they're always amazed that their legislator is a real person, number one, and that they are listened to. And I think this is something our students don't fully appreciate, is that as healthcare professionals, our legislators generally want to hear from them, want to care about an issue that we care about, and want personal stories of people that our students have met along the way who are struggling or suffering. And so this is what we have them do, and it's always a very powerful experience. So this whole idea about how do you integrate population content, and this I have to leave to you because every school is really different, but these are some findings from the interviews of the summer. Some people thought that a focused module or course on population health was the way to go. Other people thought, no, it needs to be integrated. I will tell you the focused people thought that it would get lost if it was integrated, and the integrated people couldn't see any way around it because the focused approach would then be left behind once that modular course was done. Some people talked about helping students to think about health and self first, and then gradually zoom out to a bigger view, including global health. And then others thought, no, the students come to our school because they want to learn all the skills of being a nurse. Let's do those first and get them out of the way, and then they can start thinking about those other skills, like how to talk to people who want to change, etc. Many people mentioned the spiral curriculum, which is a curriculum where you continually revisit concepts, only in a more advanced way. And then there was the whole issue of alignment of clinical placements, which was kind of suggested by the research we did with the students from Edinburgh and from Oregon. Folks, I think we're at a crossroads in our healthcare systems. I am proposing to you that we are more concerned and spend more time and more money on illness care than we do on healthcare. I guess I'd like to encourage us all to be part of advocating for change at a systems level, because it is my impression that we cannot do this by ourselves. Even though we are very powerful, we have huge numbers. In the US, we have 3 million nurses. I don't know about all healthcare professionals. In the UK, 660,000 nurses. In Australia, about half that. Again, I don't know all of your countries as far as health professionals and nurses, but we are at a time when we really need to change because our system is overburdened, and we need to find a way to help patients make changes, to help communities make changes for better health, and to reclaim that idea of health care. So I do believe that our students are our best hope for this change. Culture change doesn't happen overnight. It's something that's going to take a generation or two. But I guess I would just say to you, we need to do this for the future of our countries and for the future of healthcare. I want you to take just a moment with somebody sitting next to you and talk about one of these ideas, one of these questions. What's one idea for integrating population health into a course or curriculum that you want to implement? Or how can we help students shift the culture from illness care to health care? Or with whom can students partner to effect change? Take just 2 minutes, that's about all we have, and just chat with each other for a minute, and then maybe that will stimulate some questions to come up in the next part of this. Okay. How do I get them back? I know. All right, can we come back? Hello? I'm sorry. No, it's on here. These aren't on. Thank you. I know I'm one of those people who can't whistle, and I always wish I could at a moment like that. But I can't. And I also have a Swiss cowbell at home, but it's very loud and very annoying. But anyway, I hope you had a moment to just reflect and talk a little bit. I'm at the end here, but I want to just say two major takeaways I hope you leave this session with. One is we need to think about and teach our students how to zoom out beyond that single individual patient, even to a global level. And number two, we need to advocate and help our students learn to shift the culture from illness care to wellness care or to health care. Thank you very much, and I'm